In this lecture, we will be examining the effects of the Vietnam War on the 1968 American presidential election. As we will see, the year 1968 brought about a number of significant changes in the American political landscape, and public opinion on the Vietnam War began to markedly shift during this year. Prior to the Tet Offensive, most polls showed that a majority of Americans still supported the war effort in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, while a victory for American forces in military terms, exposed what pundits began to call the credibility gap. The Johnson administration had been consistently saying for years that American policies in Vietnam were working, yet Tet showed otherwise. The iconic image on this slide is of South Vietnamese General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner in Saigon at the start of Tet. The New Hampshire Democratic primary was held on March 12th of 1968. As a sitting president and as a skilled campaigner, Lyndon Johnson should have won this primary easily. Eugene McCarthy, who's pictured here, was an opponent of the Vietnam War, and he decided to enter the race mostly to put pressure on the party to adopt stronger anti-war platforms. Surprisingly, though, McCarthy polled 42% to Johnson's 49% in New Hampshire, showing that the president was politically very weak. Sensing a political opportunity, Senator Robert Kennedy changed his mind and decided to enter the race. Senator Kennedy announced his candidacy 4 days after the New Hampshire primary on March 16th. McCarthy's supporters believed that Kennedy had betrayed McCarthy by joining the race after initially declaring he would not run, and the two candidates became enmeshed in a bitter sequence of state primary battles. The Democratic Party thus entered a period of extreme divisiveness. The race for president became even more chaotic when President Johnson announced on March 31st he would not seek re-election. To the American public on television, he claimed he wanted to devote all of his time to bringing the Vietnam War to an end. Privately, though, Johnson had some health concerns, and he was likely concerned about the looming prospect of losing the election. Withdrawing from the race would thus allow him to potentially save face. A much larger element of chaos and violence factored into the American political system with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th. The murder of the civil rights leader sparked riots across the country. More importantly, though, this assassination provoked a general desire for greater law and order among many middle-class Americans. After Johnson's withdrawal and seeing the wide-open race, Vice President Hubert Humphrey announced his candidacy on April 27th. At the time Humphrey entered the race, McCarthy had just won 3 straight primaries. However, at this time, only 13 of the 50 states held public Democratic primaries, and Humphrey's strategy was to roll up as many delegates as possible in the non-primary states. The Democratic Party split into 4 factions. The first faction consisted of labor unions and big city political operatives like Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. This faction rallied around Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, who's in the upper left-hand corner. Supporters of Eugene McCarthy, who is in the lower left-hand corner, constituted the next faction. This group consisted mainly of college students, intellectuals, and anti-war activists. The third faction, which supported Senator Robert Kennedy, pictured in the upper right-hand corner, was primarily composed of Catholics, Hispanics, African Americans, and a few other anti-war groups. The last Democratic faction consisted of white Southern Democrats, or as they were known, Dixiecrats. Most of these voters initially supported Humphrey, but many later supported Alabama Governor George C. Wallace's third party campaign. By the beginning of June, Kennedy had won 4 state primaries, and McCarthy came out on top in 6 state primaries. Yet Humphrey's focus on the non-primary states was paying off. The chart on this slide shows the approximate delegate count after the California primary on June the 5th of 1968. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles just hours after narrowly winning the California and handily winning the South Dakota primary. Like the killing of Martin Luther King Jr., RFK's assassination was a profoundly chaotic factor in the 1968 presidential election. Some of Kennedy's supporters shifted to McCarthy. However, many of Kennedy's delegates absolutely refused to vote for McCarthy, given the bitterness between the two candidates. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, who had supported Kennedy in the earlier primaries, then entered the race and siphoned off many anti-war delegates. So again, the Democratic Party was without unification on the anti-war factions. Due to the splitting of this anti-war vote, plus Humphrey's control of the Democratic Party machinery, there was little doubt about the outcome of the Democratic Convention. Humphrey and Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine were nominated as president and vice president. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley played an important role inside the convention hall in controlling the party's platform and the process, and he also played a more notorious role regarding events that occurred outside the convention center. In what became known as the Battle of Chicago, outside the convention center, anti-war demonstrators fought with tens of thousands of Chicago police, Army troops, Illinois National Guard, and Secret Service agents over a period of 5 days. Nearly 600 protesters were arrested. Hundreds of police and protesters were injured. Some of this, of course, was sparked by the protesters themselves, who came itching for a fight, but some of this also was sort of egged on by the mayor and police administration, and there's plenty of documented cases of police brutality on unarmed and unthreatening protesters. CBS reporters Mike Wallace and Dan Rather were among the media personnel who were injured in a very interesting exchange. You can look this up on YouTube. Rather was on air with Walter Cronkite when a security officer punched him in the stomach. The rioting was especially embarrassing to Chicago Mayor Daley and the Democratic Party as a whole, and the presidential election season thus began with the Democrats being associated with disorder and violence. By comparison, the Republican convention had proceeded much more smoothly a few weeks earlier. While the Republican primary was a fairly spirited contest, Nixon led all the way and had a considerable campaign war chest going into the fall election season, and he again benefited from that sense of orderliness to the Republican convention. There thus emerged a three-way race going into the final months of the campaign. Early on, Nixon had a fairly comfortable lead over Humphrey, with Wallace a distant third in terms of popular vote. Wallace's strategy, though, was based on siphoning just enough electoral votes from the two major parties to deny either major party candidate a majority of electoral college votes, which would then have sent the election to the House of Representatives. The three candidates, however, did not differ much with regard. There are very nuanced differences on their positions regarding the Vietnam War, and early on, the war was not a major focus of the campaign. Frustrated with his inability to force Nixon into a series of debates and facing what looked like a looming defeat, Humphrey did what had previously been unthinkable. Humphrey abandoned Johnson's positions and, in effect, Johnson on the bombing of North Vietnam, calling for an immediate halt in bombing. And though Johnson was furious at what he considered to be a betrayal, after all, this was his vice president, Humphrey nonetheless began to climb in the polls. Johnson finally agreed to a bombing halt on the weekend before the election in what became known as the Halloween Peace, or another one of these October surprises we like to talk about in American politics. Progress had also been made in getting the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table, and with just a few days to go before the election, Humphrey and Nixon were in a virtual dead heat. Humphrey also benefited from a last-minute endorsement, although kind of lukewarm, by anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy. But there was yet another surprise. I guess this would be a November surprise that came from an unexpected direction. Nixon, although not guilty of the treason charge that some Democrats claimed, nonetheless used intermediaries to convince South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu that his country's fortunes would be better served under a Republican administration, and that Johnson and the Democrats planned to sell out South Vietnam during the peace talks. Thu then announced, just before the American election, that South Vietnam would boycott the peace talks, and Humphrey's short-lived election momentum stalled out. This map shows the Electoral College results for the 1968 presidential election. As expected, Wallace carried a number of southern states, but he failed to send the election to the House of Representatives, as Nixon was able to cross the majority threshold. Only about 500,000 popular votes separated Nixon and Humphrey, and while it is probably an overstatement to say that Thieus' peace talks boycott threw the election to Nixon, it is definitely clear that Nixon benefited from the South Vietnamese last-minute move. This brings to a close our look at the Vietnam War and its effects on the 1968 American presidential election.